Welcome to a Road Less Traveled podcast. I'm Hilary Haron, your host. This is a virtual edition focusing on heroines in history. We're very excited to share these stories with you from the women who have helped pave the way to the future that we are so lucky to be able to walk on. Welcome back, Erika.
Thanks. I'm excited.
So excited to continue this Women in History series. I want to know who we're talking about today.
Okay. So as you know, we're doing this recording in February, which is Black History Month, and it'll probably be released during Women's History Month. So we should talk about a Black woman.
I'm here for it. That seems like a very good reasoning to me.
Excellent. We're going to talk about Madam C.J. Walker. She was the first Black female millionaire.
Okay. All right.
And she's one of those characters who, from what I understand from my studies and, the kind of algorithm I get from my social media, she's pretty well known, I think, in the Black American community. I think white Americans don't know about her as much. She's at best a footnote in our history books. But much like the Tulsa race riots and the Tulsa massacre and some of the other very core Black history issues that are becoming more spoken about in mainstream, Madam C.J. Walker is more and more being spoken about in the mainstream. And in fact, she had a Netflix movie called Self-Made, starring, I can't remember her name, and I'll remember it later, but starring a well-known actress. And it's a caricaturized on our theme of women who have movies made about them. Version of her story, but it's a story of how she started a business and became a Black millionaire.
Okay, I'm actually writing that down right now because
excellent.
I need to watch it. Okay, so
again, I enjoyed it. Yeah,
we're talking about Black history becoming regular history because it is just it's not history isn't colored; it's just history, or at least that's what we're hoping to get. I think,
and yes. I think that's what we're hoping to get. And, you'll see things on social media that say Black history is American history. It is. At the same time, we are white women. Mm-hmm. And so remembering that Indigenous history, Black history, Asian history, whether it be within this country or internationally, is important to cultural identity for those folks. So this is very, very much an empathy thing where Black history is important to us because Black history helped make our history. Yeah. But it's more culturally significant to Black folks, I think, than certainly you and I might think it is, which is why these stories have, lived within Black communities and why Black folks are not surprised when we say Madam C.J. Walker, when we talk about Tuskegee or the Tulsa race riots. They're like, oh, yeah, this is part of what our community knows American history to be.
Well, I think it's great that it exists, at least. It has not been eradicated from the history books. Although, and a lot of things
They tried. There are history books from our lifetime that would say things like, Black slaves were happy. They used to sing. The other thing is the Trail of Tears, in which the Cherokee Nation was marched from, Florida and Georgia to Oklahoma. It was 2,000 miles. It'll say, the history books will say things like, the Indians chose to leave so that we could settle. And it's like, that's in our history book. It has been in history books in our lifetime. So having these conversations around women of color who have made a really substantial impact in our history is so important. And Madam C.J. Walker was the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. Okay. And so we're talking about things that are still relevant. She was alive when our grandparents were born.
What did she do to get there? What's her claim to fame?
Madam C.J. Walker's hair system. Let's do the kind of quick rundown background and get up to how did we get to a hair system.
Okay.
She was born in, I think it said Louisiana, and her parents had been enslaved. They were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, and they were sharecroppers. She became orphaned, wound up living with different siblings, and she married and had children at 14. And it was here in Louisiana as a sharecropper. And she took her child and she ran north to St. Louis.
There's
She
a
had
lot
a
of
bunch of
weird shit
brothers.
going on in the East.
Well, but keep in mind, it's an opportunity. Like, marriage is either going to be a binding contract or it's going to be an opportunity for independence.
Okay.
Because it depends on who you marry and what your situation is and everything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it gets you out of the household you're in. And so sometimes it's frying pan or fire.
Mm-hmm.
And so she had, I guess her brother-in-law had been abusive. I don't know the details. I haven't found it. I've not done the primary source work. So she got married to get out of that abusive household.
Got it.
And then her husband died. So she took her child and went to St. Louis. And when we talk about, again, this sort of very American history, very Black American history, this was a mass exodus. We saw this after after the Emancipation Proclamation. It was called the Great Northern Migration, in which Black folks who were previously enslaved and their children moved to Harlem. They moved to St. Louis. They moved to Cleveland. What we see is folks moving from, rural South, largely agrarian agriculture jobs, moving up to the North and getting more trades, becoming more urbanized. Okay. And Madam C.J. Walker, who was actually she was born Sarah Breedlove, Breed Love. I don't actually want to think into that name because a lot of names were literal.
No, thank you.
Yeah. So I have no actual information on that, but it does make me pause a little when I see it. Yeah. So she moved up there. She became a seamstress and a cook, and it was kind of everything. And she remarried. So we've got husband number 2. No, this is before she remarried. So she's still in St. Louis, and her hair starts to fall out. She's stressed. She's a widow. She's trying to make ends meet for her and her kid. And there was a Black woman already doing something similar to what she does. And her name was Annie Turbo. Oh goodness, I can't read my own handwriting. Malone. Annie Turbo Malone. Okay. And Madam C.J. Walker Sarah became a sales consultant for her hair company. Okay. And she started using her hair products to try to combat baldness. And she later moves to Denver, marries husband number 2. Husband number 2 helps her finance the creation of her own hair pomade. Because again, Black women use coarser products, right? They've got to keep their hair hydrated. And so she creates this pomade, and then she figures out what became the Walker system, which was how to use the pomade in conjunction with hot irons. So like modern, early versions of the modern curling iron to keep your hair healthy and shiny and all of the other things that it needs, but they work together. And so she starts this hair system in Denver. Once again, marriage number 2 doesn't work out. She divorces that guy, moves to Indianapolis.
Whoa, she got divorced during this time? That's rough.
So she's widowed, then divorced. Okay. So the role that men played in women in her life is interesting because, again, she's got this marriage component and she does something different, which is she's widowed, she's divorced, she marries a third time. A lot of marriages was not uncommon, but the way she kind of utilizes marriage is really interesting.
She has 1 child from her first marriage.
That's what I've read.
Okay.
That we know of. There's some other stuff like the Netflix show shows her adopting a young woman when she lived in Harlem. Okay. And that woman becoming her heiress. Okay. But in the research I did for this podcast, there are also several museums that have stepped forward and said, hey, this is, other than the fact that she started a pomade business and became a millionaire, Netflix really leaves out a lot of the detail. And so I'm not sure on the details of how many children she had. Did the one she had in Louisiana and moved to St. Louis with survive? I have no idea.
Okay.
Because I haven't read the papers. I've only read the secondary source material for her. But she marries the third guy, Charles Jacob Walker.
Okay.
And she rebrands herself as Madam C.J. Walker.
I like it. She kind of changes it up and takes on like a whole identity.
And Madam back then would have been the equivalent of ma'am today. It would have been used for older, distinguished women rather than Miss, be like Miss and Madam instead of Miss and Ma'am.
Okay.
So, it helped give her a little bit of a distinguished air, and she had some gravitas. And that was sort of became her public facing identity. She was no longer Sarah. She was Madam C.J. Walker, and she had the Walker hair care system. But the coolest thing, the way she actually made the money, and that I think is so interesting and why she is such a staple, she was like the Mary Kay of her day. She got sales associates. She taught them how to use the product, how to show clients how to use the product with the hot irons, the pomade, and the different products. And then they went out and sold for her. She employed 40,000 African-American men and women in the beginning of the 1900s in the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America, because we have Afro-Caribbeans. What?
That's incredible.
It is.
I mean, how does she even quantify that? And is she like the original MLM?
It is multi-level marketing. What is interesting in everything I've read is that one of the reasons she was so successful in getting salespeople is the commission was quite large. I don't know what the percentage was, but right when we think about commission sales today, it's often 10%, 20%, depending on your industry. And her commission was high enough that people could live off of it.
So to me, what this indicates, and this is what blows my mind, is that she employed that many people who made enough money to support them and their families off of this specific product that obviously not everybody is using. So they had enough people to sell to. And then when we're talking about history, it is very out of balance with the information that is mainstream distributed. So this is what blows my mind about these stories.
When you read about Madam C.J. Walker online, again, history.com, nationalwomen'smuseum.org, the Smithsonian, they're very much, she's the main character. And this last husband, Charles Jacob Walker, from whom she gets her name, is the background helper. And he helped her get started. And she did it all. Apparently she started with $1.25, not for the price of the product, for
full stop.
Like that's what she had in the bank, $1.25, and she got rolling. And
I mean, and this is like a case for, of course, another discussion about the value of the dollar at the time, is obviously different, but talking about self-made, I mean, what a freaking fantastic title. So,
and her parents had been enslaved. So it really was this, choices she made in her life that got her to a place to make that leap. And with $1.25 in your pocket, you're making a leap of faith when you're venturing out into trying to start a product and a system and have a business. And she was able to do it. And, we talked a little bit in our last podcast about the myth of the founding of America. Well, then you have this Black woman who is exactly what we want, right? Starts from nothing, pulled up by her bootstraps, can make anything happen. And then she becomes mythologized, as she should, for being the first Black woman millionaire, and for other things. But we also forget that not everybody can take $1.25 and turn it into $1 million business.
That's valid.
And so we wind up in this, like, we're stuck, right? So we want everyone to be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And yet we know the number of people who do on that kind of scale are so few. I love her because, she embodies the American spirit, the American story, the whatever, in two ways: that she did it, and that she's also the kind of the exception to the rule that we all say. We all say this is how it's supposed to be,
right? But
so few actually make it.
So did she stay married to husband number 3?
From what I can see, she did. Yes. She stayed married to number 3. He predeceased her, and she had homes in Philadelphia, Indiana, Chicago, Harlem. She lived all over the country. And I think it said she died in upstate New York.
I mean, that's freaking fantastic. And to have the ability to be mobile between those places during that time period, that's another thing that kind of blows me away. So she employed 40,000 people is kind of the estimate.
Yeah. And we have to assume part of those are in her factory, actually making and packaging the product.
So does this product, is a derivative still around today, or has it kind of transitioned from?
So as I understand it, the product itself, Madam Walker's pomade, is no longer in existence.
Okay.
Pomades in general and the types of products that Black women use on their hair, again, not an expert, just from the little research I've done and talking to some friends. Those kinds of products are still around and they are easily accessible. And when she died, she rewrote her will, checking my notes here, 2/3 of her profits for her company moving forward would go to charity.
That's marvelous.
After her death. Yes. And the other went to her heiress, who kept the business around for a little while.
I think something interesting to look into or to do some research on with her would be what happens to the business and at what point does it go away. And if she was so successful with it and she had these like progressive ways of distributing or doing or, selling, how did that not permeate the company without her presence, or did it? And then what? So that I think that would be interesting to find out.
I think so too. And knowing, sort of generally what has happened to a lot of companies, because there are still companies, Swanson's, they were the first company to figure out how to flash freeze frozen food. They're still around, but they've been bought by bigger companies, Kraft, Post, all of those. So my guess is it probably got taken over by a larger beauty or hair care product company. Because again, the product, the type of product is still very much in the mainstream.
So History Channel, if you're watching this or you're seeing this, are the Women Who Built America series.
Do they?
I don't know. I've seen The Men Who Built America.
Dude, they have one called The Products That Built America, and they spend a whole episode talking about ketchup.
Yes, that was my favorite. I showed it to you.
Good. Oh, good. Okay. So
where History Channel, since it you, where is the Women Who Built America? Where are those stories and why are they lost? That's why it's important we're talking about them, as I swag.
Not just that we're talking about them, but let's go back to, in current events, who is deciding which history we need to look at?
That's valid.
90% guarantee the History Channel is men, probably white men.
And when we talk about male dominated, it doesn't have to be male dominated by volume. It can be male dominated by decision-making authority, or
correct.
It could be volume, but by decision-making authority, or even if you're working in the background, how that ebbs or sways.
It doesn't matter if your company has 100 women and one man. If the man is making the decisions, it's male dominated.
I agree with that.
Anyway, so I think that's why we haven't seen those discussions. Now, again, we've seen like the National Women's History Museum, which is, I believe, a branch of the Smithsonian. So we're seeing more of that. We've seen the creation of the Indigenous History Museum, the Black History Museum, both part of Smithsonian. They're amazing. I haven't been in a while, but I've been to both. I've been to the Black History, but not yet the Indigenous. It's a newer one. And we're seeing those conversations more because I'm happy to say that there is a decent chunk of women going into academia, and those women are filtering into the museum systems and the archive systems that are choosing what we're talking about and where.
So in your experience in academia, are you seeing that women care more about the stories of other women? Or are you seeing both men and women saying, okay, this is really a relevant part of history and we need to record it more?
The majority of books about women's history are written by women. So I think just like with cultural things, whether you're Black or Indigenous or Asian, those resonate with you. So it's women coming into academia with, I want to look at this issue. I want to look at this person. And it's sort of sparked the bigger discussion. And really in the last 20 years or so is when we've seen this shift in academia towards a more balanced discussion of gender in history. There was a big wave in the late 90s, and we've kind of seen it continue since, with academics publishing books about not just individual women, but like unruly women of history.
Yes. Oh, gonna need that.
So, and this is again written by a woman, Politics of Social and Sexual Control in the Old South, and it is published by a Chapel Hill, so North Carolina Press. So we've seen the academics move that direction. We're not seeing popular history books, like the Barnes and Noble history books written about women, at least not that are substantive. They'll be kind of more fluff pieces about women in history.
Interesting. Well, I mean, at least there's something. I mean,
there is something. We're getting there.
I mean, we hear fun anecdote for people tuning in. When you and I were at Disneyland with my kids not that long ago, and we took my daughter to see Belle and what's his name, Gaston. And she was like, "I don't want you, Gaston," and I was like, "Oh, maybe overdid it with the feminism on that girl." But I think that allowing our children the space to say, "No, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in this." Yeah. Is going to be incredible for the future. I think it's already having an impact on what's put in our history books now. I really hope to see that continue. And then having people like you who are an advocate for this kind of stuff, put it out into places where maybe it wouldn't normally be. Like some of the stuff I would never have even thought. And it's through our discussions where I'm like, oh, you know what? I think my daughter needs to be exposed to that.
Yeah. Well, and this is a conversation I had a couple years ago. So one of my projects, because in academia, you publish papers and you're doing class projects and all kinds of stuff. Some of them that aren't directly related to your final dissertation topic, they're sort of like exploratory or for a class. And one of the projects I've worked on, that I've gone to a couple conferences with, is discussions of enslaved people in the White House and what role enslaved folks played in the White House in the early years. So Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, in making political functions possible, in making the White House function.
Yeah, but you would never hear about those today because God forbid that we associate the reality of history with, the current office,
right?
Not with the current president or anything, but with the current idea we have in our minds of the White House.
Right. Well, but what I think is important about this, again, is we're talking about representation. I happen to be at a really great conference, and one of the panels was more geared at like grad students, and it was about making inclusive spaces, and it was a little more discussion. It wasn't just sort of sit and be lectured at. And I asked this panel of largely, well, she was a Black moderator, white panelists, all doing projects on race at universities in the South. So most of the universities in the South were physically built by enslaved people or the ancestors of enslaved people. And so we had these white panelists talking about it. And I asked the moderator, like, hey, I am also a white person talking about enslaved experiences. How do we bring more Black people into this discussion? And am I the right person to have this discussion? And it was really interesting to see all of the other panelists like, oh, I didn't think to think about that. And I was like, come on, guys.
What was the moderator's reaction? Because I mean, full disclosure, even I don't know how to be an advocate in the right way. And I try to do what I try to do. And even then I don't feel like it's enough or I'm doing it right. What was the moderator's reaction?
She was so fabulously blunt. She said the solution is money. The majority of academia is white, and Black people are barred from it because they don't have the funds to get to it, right? Like to go through college, to go to a graduate school. Even if they get into a graduate program, they might not be able to have the luxury of living off of pennies for a year and not being able to pay rent or whatever it is, right? So many of us, even at LSU, the history program is largely white. And we have a whole section on Louisiana history, and it's largely white. So giving financial access to children and young people of color so that they can have the advantages to get into these programs. Because when we talk about systemic racism or when we talk about poverty, it's not overt. We're not saying, oh, we don't call you names anymore, so we're not racist. We're saying that the political and economic structures that exist regularly and systemically disadvantage people of color, which means they don't have the buffers that I have as a white woman.
Right. Well, and some of like what we're talking about here is contrasted sharply with Madam C.J. Walker, with what she did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because she was, she bucked the whole system. I don't care about the system. I'm doing it, and I'm going to do it my way. And clearly not everybody has the strength, the bandwidth, the know-how, the timing, the universe on their side, whatever you want to call it, or whatever combination of all of those things. So from an academic's perspective, how do we advocate for these things, as well as, contributing these stories and encapsulating them for the future?
How do we preserve these? How do we move forward? There's a field that's growing. It's, again, been around for about 20 years. It's called public history.
Define public history and how that's different from, is there private history?
So public history is the idea that what we do as academics and historians should be accessible to the general population. So think about the books I just told you about, the one I used earlier, the one I showed you, Unruly Women. They're published by academic presses. They're not written for a general audience. But you know what is designed for a general audience? A museum.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we make museums accurate, accessible, functional, and bring stories into those spheres? So you're going to see a lot of museums today that are, even if it's the Smithsonian, they're going to have one random wall with somebody you've never heard of, and it'll be 4 or 5 pictures and a couple of paragraphs, because they are understanding that public history is about being accessible, and it's about actually telling the story that you're in. So, like, I looked at the NC State program, and they were partnered with some really cool foundations and museums in North Carolina that were trying to tell stories of different communities within North Carolina. And you could do internships with them to work through, your degree and stuff. And so it's just the people in that community that thinks that's important, but that's their history. And so they want to see it represented, even if it's only in the county museum or whatever, right?
Well, and that's kind of the how do you make people care thing, how do you make people care about this particular thing or that particular thing?
How do you make people care?
Yes.
One, make it fun. Some of my favorite museums are kids museums recently.
Okay.
Because you can touch everything. Kids can touch everything.
Interactive.
And I think more and more, I think more and more academics are realizing interactive, whether it be very sophisticated or very, simple, is still something people want, and adults will get into it. And so we're seeing more interactive stuff at museums. The Revolutionary War Museum in Yorktown, which is outside of Williamsburg, Virginia, they have you can touch things and screens change, and you can go outside and see people fire a musket, right? So then you're going to ask, how do you fire a musket?
And just other side of the same coin, why do we think Las Vegas is so successful?
Very interactive.
Yes.
True. Also, I am not against giving 21-year-old and over beer when they walk into a museum.
Okay.
I think it would stimulate conversation. Make it ale if it's old fashioned.
Right.
I don't know. It would never hurt.
Some sort of social lubricant, basically, is what you're saying. It's not
exactly,
maybe not a place to go get wasted. But people learn in different ways. People have different levels of comfortability talking to other people, or even learning about things that maybe they want to learn about but are uncomfortable, or are afraid somebody's going to think they're doing it wrong.
Yeah. And there's a lot of ivory tower in academia, right? The Ivies produce something like 90% of professors in this country, and yet state schools like LSU have a PhD program. But to bring it back, let's bring it back to Madam C.J. Walker here. She was as well known in the Black community while she was alive for her product as she was for her philanthropy.
Oh, that's
and
incredible.
So, she paid for something like 6 scholarships for women to go down to Tuskegee and go to the Tuskegee Institute, which trained women of color to work jobs, gave them skills. She was on the anti-lynching campaign. She was politically active and gave money to these causes. She gave $5,000 to the NAACP to jumpstart one of their campaigns that was for women of color. Again, not to totally get off track, but when we talk about kind of living in end-stage capitalism, if you make $85 billion, what are you going to do with it all? And she kind of realized, like, I have everything. I have money. I have everything I need.
Yeah.
So I am secure. Now that I have secured myself, I'm going to give. And she gave to everything she could, from very local to, again, the big national groups. And it was a really interesting practice what you preach kind of woman. And again, she came from a sharecropping daughter of enslaved folks. Mm-hmm. I just think she is such an amazing story. And, hopefully she's becoming more mainstream for us.
Excuse me. She's an incredible story. And I'm very excited to learn more about her. I have a couple questions that I'm going to, take to my Google sources, and I'm going to watch her show on Netflix. So we got to check her out.
So it's worth it. Again, you're so welcome. Again, I'm all for watching the historical stuff, even if it's not quite accurate, because it'll get you to those questions.
It creates interest. I mean,
it does. Yeah.
I like it. Well, thank you. I appreciate you sharing.
You're so welcome.
Story, and I'll talk to you soon. A huge thank you to our incredible guests for sharing their stories, wisdom, and breaking down barriers with us. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. Your support means the world to me and helps spread the word about the amazing women paving the road less traveled in male-dominated industries. If you have suggestions for a future guest or topic you'd like me to explore, please reach out on social media. I'd love to hear from you. Follow me on your favorite social platform for updates and behind the scenes. Keep pushing boundaries, challenging norms, and lifting each other up.